History tells us that Napoleon Bonaparte lost his empire on a battlefield called Waterloo. They tell us it was a clash of giants, a final stand, a predictable end to a legendary era. But they're wrong. The truth isn't found in the grand charges or the famous speeches. It's hidden in a vacuum of time. 4 missing hours on a Sunday morning where the greatest military mind in history simply vanished. While the world waited for the first cannon to fire, the fate of every person in Europe was being decided by a cup of coffee, a patch of mud, and a silence that shouldn't have been there. Why did the god of war wait until the sun was high to start the fight that would save his crown? Why did a shipment of bullets destined for a vital farmhouse simply disappear? And how did one family in London use these missing hours to pull off the greatest financial heist in human history? Today, we're stepping into the fog. This is the story of the minutes that slipped through the emperor's fingers, the shadow over Waterloo that changed the world forever. History has a strange habit of dressing up in its finest clothes right before it gets covered in blood. If you wanted to find the exact moment the fate of Europe hung by a single silken thread, you wouldn't look at a muddy field in Belgium. You would look at a ballroom in Brussels on the night of June 15th, 1815. In that room was the who's who of the Anglo-Allied High Command. Officers in scarlet tunics, gold braids shimmering under the chandeliers, spinning around the room with the daughters of the European aristocracy. It was a sea of confidence. They believed the ogre, Napoleon, was safely contained, miles away, still gathering his strength. But while the violins played, a shadow was moving across the map. Napoleon hadn't just escaped exile on Elba. He had performed a military miracle. He had marched across the French border with the speed of a predator. While the British officers were toast-making and flirting, 120,000 French bayonets were already crossing the River Sambre. Napoleon was doing the one thing the Duke of Wellington thought was impossible. He was striking first. Then came the moment that changed the world. A mud-splattered messenger arrived at the Duchess's door. He wasn't dressed for a ball. He was dressed for a nightmare. He carried a dispatch for Wellington. The Duke, the Iron Duke himself, took the paper, read it in the flicker of candlelight, and for a split second, the mask slipped. He didn't panic. He didn't shout. But he leaned over to his host and whispered words that have echoed through the centuries. Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He has gained 24 hours' march on me. In the vocabulary of the 19th century, humbugged meant to be totally and utterly hoodwinked. The world's greatest defensive general had been caught with his boots off. This is where the missing hours begin, because Wellington didn't immediately call for a retreat or a charge. He stayed at the party. For nearly 2 more hours, he forced himself to remain calm, to keep eating, to keep smiling, so as not to trigger a total civilian panic in Brussels. He knew that if the guests saw him run, the city would fall into chaos. But those 2 hours were a gamble of staggering proportions. As the officers were quietly pulled away from their dance partners, some still in their dancing shoes and silk stockings, they weren't heading to barracks. They were galloping straight into the darkness, toward a tiny crossroads called Quatre Bras. There is a haunting irony in that night. Many of the young men laughing over champagne would be dead before the sun went down the next day. The transition from the high society sparkle of the ballroom to the visceral, bone-chilling reality of the front line was so fast, it was dizzying. Why did Wellington wait? Was it truly to prevent panic? Or was he still trying to figure out if Napoleon's move was a feint? Some historians argue this was the first great intelligence failure of the campaign. By the time the British army truly began to move, Napoleon had already driven a wedge between Wellington and his Prussian allies. This shadow over Waterloo didn't start with a cannon blast. It started with a missed beat in a waltz. It started with a general who was humbugged and an emperor who was moving faster than the news could travel. As the sun began to peek over the horizon on the 16th, the velvet and silk were gone, replaced by the smell of wet gunpowder and the realization that the missing hours of that night had just handed Napoleon the greatest head start of his life. The ball was over. The butcher's bill was about to be presented. If the Duchess of Richmond's Ball was the moment Wellington lost his lead, Then the morning of June 18th was the moment Napoleon Bonaparte let the world slip through his fingers. To understand the missing hours of Waterloo, you have to look past the grand strategies and the maps and look at the mud and the mind of a man who believed he was a god of war, yet was currently being reminded of his very human fragility. The sun rose on that Sunday morning over a landscape that looked less like a battlefield and more like a swamp. A torrential, apocalyptic thunderstorm had lashed the Belgian countryside all night. This wasn't just a bit of drizzle. It was the kind of rain that turns topsoil into a thick, glutinous paste, the kind that swallows boots and anchors cannon wheels as if they were set in wet concrete. Napoleon stood in the mud at his headquarters, look at you, clutching a cup of coffee. He was the master of the blitzkrieg long before the word existed. His entire philosophy was built on speed, on the maneuver sur les derrières, on hitting the enemy before they could blink. By all logic, he should have ordered the attack at the first crack of dawn, roughly 4 a.m. And yet, the cannons stayed silent. 5 o'clock passed, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock. The missing hours began to stack up like corpses. The official reason, the one Napoleon's supporters have clung to for centuries, was the artillery. Napoleon was an officer of the pens and the big guns. He knew that his beautiful daughters, his nickname for his 12-pounder cannons, were useless if they couldn't maneuver. He believed that if he fired into the wet ground, the cannonballs wouldn't bounce. They would simply plop into the mud like stones in a pond, losing their lethal kinetic energy. He wanted the sun to bake the ground, to give his iron shot the ability to skip and tear through the British lines. But as the clock ticked toward noon, that decision was turning into a death sentence. While the emperor waited for the mud to dry, the Prussians, Wellington's missing link, were clawing their way through the woods toward him. Every minute Napoleon waited for the sun to come out was a minute he gave General Blucher to march. It was a trade-off. He wanted better physics for his cannons, but he was sacrificing the strategic geometry of the entire campaign. But was it really just the mud? This is where the story gets murky and the shadow grows longer. There is a side to Napoleon on that morning that the history books often gloss over. The man was 45 years old, but in empire years he was ancient. He was suffering from a flare-up of chronic hemorrhoids, so severe he could barely sit on his horse. He was likely dealing with the onset of the stomach cancer that would eventually kill him. On the morning he needed to be the thunderbolt of Europe, he was a middle-aged man in immense physical agony, reportedly lethargic and strangely detached. His generals were shouting at him. Marshal Soult, who had fought Wellington in Spain and knew the British were like a solid wall, once they dug in, pleaded with Napoleon to attack sooner or to change tactics. Napoleon's response was a chilling display of overconfidence. He snapped back, "Just because you have been beaten by Wellington, you think he's a good general. I tell you that Wellington is a bad general, that the English are bad troops, and this affair will be nothing more than eating breakfast." It was a Imagine the tension in the French camp during those 5 hours of silence. The soldiers were wet, hungry, and standing in knee-deep slush. They could see the British on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, quietly fortifying their positions, eating their own meager rations, and watching the French watch them. It was a psychological war of nerves. By delaying the start, Napoleon allowed his own men's adrenaline to sour into fatigue before a single shot was fired. When the first cannon finally roared at 11:30 a.m., nearly 8 hours after the sun had risen, the window of opportunity hadn't just closed, it had been slammed shut. If Napoleon had attacked at 6 a.m., the British would have fought alone. By starting at noon, he ensured that by the time the battle reached its climax, he would be fighting two armies at once. This delay is the great what-if of the 19th century. If you remove those 5 hours of hesitation, you likely remove the British Empire's dominance of the next 100 years. You potentially see a French-dominated Europe that stretches into the 20th century. But Napoleon was no longer the hungry young captain of the siege of Toulon. He was an emperor who had started to believe his own propaganda. He believed the sun of Austerlitz would always shine for him, even through the Belgian clouds. He didn't realize that the mud wasn't his enemy. Time was. and as the first French infantry columns finally began to churn through the muck toward the British lines, the shadow of the Prussian army was already lengthening across his right flank. The breakfast he promised was about to turn into a feast of crows, all because he chose to wait for the world to dry beneath his feet. The missing hours weren't just a tactical error. They were a symptom of a man who had forgotten that in war, the only thing more dangerous than a powerful enemy is a ticking clock. If the history of Waterloo were a courtroom drama, the man in the dock would be Emmanuel de Grouchy. He is the ultimate scapegoat, the man whose name became synonymous with the soldier who didn't show up. But as we peel back the layers of the missing hours, we find something more complex than simple incompetence. We find a man trapped in a prison of his own rigid obedience, wandering through a tactical fog while the world burned just a few miles away. Imagine being in Grouchy's boots on the morning of June 18th. He wasn't a small-time officer. He was a marshal of France, and he was in command of 33,000 men, a force larger than many entire European armies. Napoleon had handed him a specific mission: chase the Prussians. Don't let them join Wellington. Stay on their heels with a sword at their back. It sounded simple, but in the chaos of a retreat, chasing an army is like trying to catch smoke in a windstorm. While Napoleon was waiting for the mud to dry at Waterloo, Grouchy was breakfasting in the village of Wellington. He was eating strawberries, a detail that his critics have never let him forget. While he sat there, the very ground began to tremble. To the west, the horizon wasn't just rumbling, it was growling. It was the sound of hundreds of heavy cannons opening up at Waterloo. One of Grouchy's subordinates, the fiery General Gerard, jumped to his feet. He didn't need a map or a telescope. He had his ears. He turned to Grouchy and gave the advice that has become a legend in military history. Il faut marcher au canon. We must march toward the sound of the guns. In the unwritten rules of Napoleonic warfare, this was the golden law. If you're lost, if you are unsure, if your orders are old, you turn your horse toward the loudest noise and you ride until you find the enemy. If Grouchy had turned his 33,000 men right then and there, they would have crashed into the side of the Prussian column or arrived at Napoleon's side by mid-afternoon. The shadow over Waterloo would have been lifted by a French victory. But Grouchy hesitated. He looked at the written orders in his hand, orders that were already hours old, written by a distracted Napoleon who hadn't anticipated the Prussians moving so fast. Grouchy was a man of the old school. He was terrified of the emperor's temper. To him, the ink on the paper was more real than the thunder in the air. He told Gerard, "No, my orders are to follow the Prussians toward Wavre. I will not deviate. This is the great tragedy of the missing hours." For the next several hours, 33,000 of France's best soldiers were effectively deleted from the map. They weren't fighting. They weren't retreating. They were simply marching. They were wandering through the Belgian countryside, chasing a Prussian rearguard that was leading them on a wild goose chase, while the main Prussian army was already slamming into Napoleon's flank. Was there something more sinister at play? Some historians have whispered about conspiracy. Was Grouchy secretly in league with the Bourbons? Was he intentionally sabotaging the emperor? Probably not. The truth is often more boring but more devastating. He was paralyzed by the cult of the leader. Napoleon had spent years training his marshals to be tools, not thinkers. He wanted executioners, not innovators. In the moment of crisis, when he needed a man with the soul of a gambler, he found himself with a man with the soul of a clerk. As Grouchy led his men away from the sound of the cannons, he was creating a vacuum. He was the ghost of Waterloo, a phantom force that everyone expected but nobody saw. Napoleon kept looking at the horizon, telling his tired troops, "Look, the dark mass in the distance. It's Grouchy. He's coming." But the dark mass wasn't Grouchy. It was the end of the empire. While Grouchy was busy capturing the town of Wavre, a meaningless victory against a skeleton crew, his emperor was losing the world. When Grouchy finally realized his mistake, it was far too late. The sun was setting, the French line was breaking, and the 33,000 men who could have saved the day were miles away, wondering why the sky had gone silent. Grouchy didn't lose the battle because he was a traitor or a coward. He lost it because he couldn't imagine a world where the orders on the paper were wrong and the sound of the cannons was right. He followed the letter of the law, and in doing so, he signed the death warrant of the Napoleonic Age. In the story of the missing hours, Grouchy is the ultimate reminder that in the heat of history, the most dangerous thing you can be is a man who follows the map instead of the terrain. If the morning was a slow-motion disaster of mud and hesitation, the early afternoon was a sudden explosion of thunder and steel. This is the chapter of the battle where the missing hours were almost reclaimed by a single, desperate stroke of British violence. It's the story of a Union brigade, a heavy cavalry force that didn't just charge. They launched themselves like a bolt of lightning into the heart of the French machine. By 1:30 p.m., the French were finally moving. Napoleon's Grand Battery, 80 massive cannons, had been screaming for over an hour, trying to soften the British line. Then, nearly 20,000 French infantrymen began to stomp through the rye fields in massive, terrifying columns. They were singing the Marseillaise, their drums beating a rhythm of inevitable conquest. To the British soldiers waiting on the ridge, it looked like a wall of blue and steel was rising out of the earth to swallow them whole. Wellington's infantry was wavering. The center of the Allied line was beginning to fray under the sheer psychological weight of the French advance. The shadow was deepening. If the French broke through now, the battle would be over before the Prussians even arrived. Enter the Earl of Uxbridge and his heavy cavalry. The Union Brigade was a unique force, composed of the Royals, English, the Enniskillants, Irish, and the famous Scots Greys. Men on massive gray horses, shouting Scotland forever. They weren't just soldiers, they were the heavy metal of the 19th century. They waited until the French infantry was just yards away, disordered by the climb up the slope, and then they let go of the reins. It wasn't a gallop at first. You can't gallop in deep Belgian mud. It was a slow, terrifying surge. But as the momentum built, it became an unstoppable tide of 2,000 horses and 4,000 tons of muscle. They crashed into the French columns with a sound like a ship hitting a reef. The carnage was total. The French infantry, caught in the open and unable to form defensive squares, were trampled and hacked down. In a matter of minutes, the invincible French advance was turned into a screaming mob. The Union Brigade even managed to capture 2 of Napoleon's prized eagles, the sacred gilded standards that represented the soul of his regiments. For a fleeting moment, the missing hours of the morning did matter. The British had won the center. But then, the shadow returned in a different form, the adrenaline-fueled madness of the cavalry itself. In the heat of the charge, the British officers lost control. These were brave men, but they were also aristocrats who viewed war as a high-stakes fox hunt. Instead of stopping, regrouping, and retreating back to the safety of the ridge, they kept going. They were drunk on victory. They charged across the valley, through the French mud, and all the way to Napoleon's Grand Battery on the opposite hill. They reached the French cannons. They started sabering the gunners. But their horses were blown. The animals were heaving, their lungs burning, their legs trembling from the mile-long sprint through the muck. Napoleon, watching from his telescope, saw the opening. He didn't hesitate. He loosed his own elite lancers and cuirassiers, armored giants on fresh horses. The Union Brigade, scattered and exhausted, stood no chance. The hunters became the prey. The French lancers rode them down with clinical efficiency, poking the British riders off their tired horses like they were practice targets. By the time the dust settled, the Union Brigade had been effectively annihilated. They had saved Wellington's center, yes, but they had also destroyed the only heavy reserve the British had. The tragedy of this hour is the missing leadership. If the British cavalry had been disciplined, if they had pulled back after breaking the infantry, they could have held the valley all afternoon. Instead, they left a void. For the next 3 hours, Wellington would have to face the French without his heavy hammers. As the survivors limped back up the ridge, the battlefield fell into a strange, temporary lull. The French infantry was shattered, but the British cavalry was gone. The missing hours were still ticking away, and the sun was starting to move toward the west. The battle had become a bloody stalemate, a waiting game where the only question left was, who would arrive first? The shadow of the Prussians, or the final, desperate fury of the emperor? La Haye Sainte was the most important piece of real estate in the world. It sat directly in front of Wellington's center, a stubborn island of stone in a sea of mud. While the grand maneuvers of the morning had failed, the war now boiled down to this: a few hundred men, a pile of bricks, and a mysterious logistical failure that nearly handed Napoleon the keys to Europe. The defense of the farm was entrusted to the King's German Legion, KGL, elite soldiers who hated Napoleon with a cold, professional fury. Their orders were simple: hold the farm at all costs. As long as the KGL held La Haye Sainte, the French couldn't launch a direct assault on the British center without being chewed up by flanking fire. By 3 p.m., the shadow over the battle took the form of a logistical nightmare. The French, realizing the farm was the linchpin of the entire line, began to swarm it like angry hornets. They set the barn roof on fire. They climbed the walls. They hammered at the gates. Inside, the Germans were putting on a masterclass in marksmanship. These men were armed with Baker rifles, the snipers of the age, which were far more accurate than the standard muskets. Every time a French officer got within 50 yards, he was picked off. But then, the fire from the farmhouse began to falter. Not because the men were dying, but because they were reaching into their pouches and finding nothing. This is one of the most baffling missing hours of the battle. The KGL used a specific caliber of ammunition for their rifles, different from the standard British musket ball. As the afternoon wore on, their commander, Major Baring, sent frantic messengers back to the ridge, begging for a resupply. "We are out of balls. We are down to our last 5 rounds. Send the wagons." The wagons never came. Historians have scratched their heads over this for 2 centuries. Was it the mud? Did the ammunition wagons get stuck in the graveyard of horses left behind by the Union Brigade? Or was it a staff officer's blunder, sending standard musket balls to men who needed rifle rounds? Whatever the cause, those missing bullets changed the course of the afternoon. By 6 p.m., the situation inside the farm was desperate. The Germans were fighting with bayonets, clubbing French soldiers with the butts of their rifles, and even throwing bricks from the walls. But you cannot hold a fortress with stones against a professional army. The French finally burst through the doors. Of the 400 original defenders, only 42 survived the slaughter. The fall of La Haye Sainte was the closest Napoleon ever came to victory that day. With the farm in French hands, Napoleon brought up his horse artillery. They were so close to the British line that they could see the buttons on the soldiers' coats. They began to pour canister shot, essentially giant cans of ball bearings, directly into Wellington's ranks. The British center didn't just bend, it began to snap. Entire regiments were being erased. Wellington himself was heard to mutter, "Give me night," or "Give me Blucher." This was the moment of the missing French reserve. If Napoleon had sent in his elite Imperial Guard right then, at 6:30 p.m., the moment the farm fell, the British line would likely have disintegrated. The road to Brussels would have been open. But Napoleon hesitated again. He was distracted by a new shadow appearing on his right flank. He was looking at the horizon, trying to see if the approaching troops were his Marshal Grouchy or the Prussian Spectre. He waited 30 minutes to confirm. In war, 30 minutes is an eternity. Those 30 minutes allowed Wellington to pull troops from his flanks and plug the hole in his center. By the time Napoleon finally decided to commit his final reserves, the ghost of La Haye Sainte had done its job. The Germans had held the farm just long enough to burn through the emperor's clock. The mystery of the missing ammunition at La Haye Sainte remains a dark stain on British logistics, but it serves as a reminder. Sometimes the fate of an empire doesn't depend on a grand strategy, but on a single wagon lost in the mud. For the better part of the afternoon, the Battle of Waterloo was a boxing match between 2 exhausted heavyweights. Napoleon and Wellington were locked in a clinch, both bloody, both refusing to fall. But while they traded blows in the mud, a third player was approaching from the east, a force that would turn a tactical stalemate into a total annihilation. This was the Prussian army, led by a man who was 72 years old, obsessed with revenge, and recently survived being run over by his own horse. His name was Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, but his men called him Marshal Forward. And on this afternoon, he was the shadow that would swallow Napoleon's sun. To understand the miracle of the Prussian arrival, you have to understand the geography of the missing hours. On the morning of the 18th, the Prussians were in Wavre, nearly 10 miles away. To get to Waterloo, they had to march through the defile of St. Lambert, a narrow, treacherous passage of deep ravines and thick woods. The rain from the previous night had turned these paths into a soup of yellow clay. The French scouts had looked at those woods and reported back to Napoleon. The terrain is impassable for an army. The Prussians are out of the game. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Napoleon believed in the physics of the mud. Blücher believed in the physics of hatred. He told his exhausted, mud-caked soldiers, "I have promised my brother Wellington. Would you make me a liar?" When the cannons got stuck in the clay, the Prussian infantry didn't wait for horses. They put their shoulders to the wheels. They literally carried their army through the forest. By 4:30 p.m., the first Prussian units began to emerge from the tree line at the village of Plancenoit, directly on Napoleon's right flank. At first, the French officers tried to convince their men it was Grouchy. They circulated a lie through the ranks that the approaching dark mass was French reinforcements. But as the shadow drew closer, the truth became undeniable. The black uniforms and the distinct Prussian eagle flags were unmistakable. Napoleon's right flank, which had been a solid line, suddenly had to bend into a V shape to face this new threat. He had to peel away his elite young guard and several battalions of the Imperial Guard just to keep the Prussians from seizing the crossroads behind him. This is the hidden math of Waterloo. Every French soldier sent to stop the Prussians at Plancenoit was a soldier who wasn't available to break Wellington's center. The missing hours of the morning had allowed the Prussians to arrive just as the British were at their weakest. The fighting in Plancenoit was some of the most brutal of the entire Napoleonic Wars. There was no room for grand maneuvers. It was house-to-house, room-to-room combat. The Prussians were fighting for the liberation of their homeland. The French were fighting for the survival of their emperor. The village changed hands 5 times. Churchyards became mass graves. By 7 p.m., the Prussian pressure was so intense that Napoleon realized his window was closing. He was being squeezed in a giant vice. To his front was Wellington, battered but standing. To his right was Blücher, relentless and growing stronger by the minute. Napoleon knew that if he didn't win in the next hour, he would never win again. The Prussian specter had done what no amount of British musketry could do. It had forced the emperor to commit his final, most sacred reserve before he was ready. The shadow wasn't just on the ground anymore. It was on Napoleon's soul. He looked toward the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean one last time. He reached for his old guard, the men who had never lost, the men who had followed him from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Russia. It was time for the final gamble. But as the guard began to march, they weren't marching into a victory. By 7:30 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley. The air was a thick, acrid soup of sulfur and pulverized soil. Napoleon knew the clock had run out. The Prussians were tearing into his flank at Plancenoit, and Wellington's center, though bleeding, refused to snap. The emperor had one card left to play. It was the old guard. These weren't just soldiers. They were the titans of the era. To join the old guard, you had to be a veteran of multiple campaigns, stand a certain height, and possess a level of grim discipline that bordered on the supernatural. They were the invincibles. In 20 years of war across Europe, the Guard had never retreated. When the rest of the army saw the tall bearskin hats moving forward, they knew the battle was over. Napoleon rose in his stirrups and pointed his hat toward the British ridge. The drums began the potted charge, the heartbeat of the empire, and the Guard began their ascent. They marched in massive, rectangular columns, stepping over the piles of dead as if they were nothing more than stones. They didn't shout. They didn't fire. They just marched. On the ridge, Wellington was waiting. He had ordered his infantry to lie down in the tall rye grass to shield them from the French artillery. From the valley floor, it looked like the British ridge was empty, abandoned by a broken army. The guard reached the crest, believing they were about to walk into an easy victory. Then, the missing hours of preparation paid off. Wellington, tucked behind a regiment of guards, gave the command, "Stand up, guards, make ready." In an instant, nearly 2,000 British soldiers rose out of the earth like ghosts. They were in a line 4 deep, their muskets leveled. The French guard, caught in a narrow column formation, could only fire with their front few ranks. The British, in their long line, could fire every single barrel at once. The first British volley was a wall of lead that tore the head off the French column. It wasn't a skirmish, it was a physical shock. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard faltered. They stopped. They tried to deploy, but the British kept firing, volley after volley, a rhythmic, mechanical destruction. And then the impossible happened. A cry went up from the French ranks, a cry that had never been heard on a Napoleonic battlefield. La garde recule. The guard is retreating. It was a psychological earthquake. If the guard was retreating, the world was ending. The French army, already exhausted and squeezed by the Prussians, shattered. The retreat turned into a rout. The Invincibles were being swept away by the very bad general Napoleon had laughed at over breakfast. As the guard fell back, Wellington stood in his stirrups and waved his hat toward the French. It was the signal for a general advance. The entire British line, which had been suffering in silence for 8 hours, surged forward with a roar. Napoleon watched through his glass, his face a mask of pale shock. The shadow had finally overtaken him. The man who had conquered Moscow, Berlin, and Vienna was now just a fugitive in a sea of fleeing men. He tried to form the last remnants of the guard into squares to buy himself time to escape, but even they were being swallowed by the rising tide of Prussian cavalry. The missing hours of his morning hesitation had led him here, to a sunset where his finest men were dying in the mud to protect a retreat that would never end. The gamble had failed. The invincible guard was broken, and with them, the dream of a Napoleonic Europe was trampled into the Belgian clay. While the smoke was still clearing over the ridges of Waterloo, and the air remained thick with the scent of spent gunpowder, a different kind of battle was beginning. This one didn't involve muskets or bayonets, but information and speed. In the 19th century, news was the most valuable commodity on Earth, and the missing hours between the end of the fight and the arrival of the official report created a vacuum that one man was ready to exploit. That man was Nathan Rothschild, the head of the London branch of the most powerful banking family in history. According to the legend, a story that has been whispered in financial circles for 2 centuries, Rothschild didn't wait for the British government to hear from Wellington. He had his own private shadow network of agents, couriers, and ships. As the French army broke and Napoleon fled toward Paris, a Rothschild agent was reportedly waiting on the coast of Belgium. The agent allegedly secured a copy of a Dutch newspaper or a private dispatch and braved a storm to cross the English Channel. By the time he reached London, he was hours ahead of the official government messenger, Henry Percy. While the British ministers were still biting their nails, wondering if their army had been annihilated, Nathan Rothschild already knew the truth. The story goes that Rothschild walked onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange and took his usual position by a stone pillar. He didn't look like a man celebrating a victory. He looked grim. He began to sell. The other traders watched him with eagle eyes. In their minds, if Rothschild was selling, it meant only one thing: Wellington had lost. If the ogre had won at Waterloo, the British economy would collapse. Panic swept the floor. Everyone began to dump their government bonds, known as consols. The price plummeted, crashing to pennies on the pound. Then, at the very last second before the official news arrived, Rothschild's agent stepped in and quietly bought up the entire market at a fraction of its value. When the official news finally broke, when the dirt-stained Henry Percy burst into a London dinner party with the captured French eagles and shouted that the emperor was defeated, the market skyrocketed. In those missing hours of communication, Rothschild had allegedly multiplied his fortune and gained a level of influence over the British economy that would last for generations. Now, modern historians love to debate the details of this story. Did he really use carrier pigeons? Did he intentionally trigger a panic? While some of the more dramatic details might be financial folklore, the core truth remains. Nathan Rothschild's information network did beat the British government by a full day. The government's official report was delayed by the same missing hours that plagued the battlefield. The courier had to navigate the chaos of the retreat, find a boat in the middle of a storm, and ride through the night. In the gap between the event and the report, the world changed. The Waterloo story is a reminder that the shadow isn't just a military phenomenon. It's a gap in human knowledge. In 1815, the world moved at the speed of a galloping horse or a fluttering wing. If you could see through the fog of war just a few hours faster than your neighbor, you could win a kingdom or a fortune. The Rothschild legend is the economic echo of the battle. It shows that while Napoleon lost his empire because he couldn't control the time on the battlefield, the victors built theirs by mastering the time it took for the truth to travel. Waterloo didn't just end a war. It inaugurated a new age where information was the ultimate weapon and the missing hours were where the real power resided. History is often treated as a straight line, an inevitable sequence of dominoes falling toward a fixed conclusion. But Waterloo is different. Because of those missing hours, the battle feels less like a solid wall and more like a house of cards. If you pull just one card, 1 hour of mud, one late messenger, one breakfast of strawberries, the entire 19th century collapses and reassembles into something unrecognizable. This is the what-if vault, where we look at the alternate timelines hidden in the shadows of the battlefield. The 7 a.m. strike. What if the ground had dried just a few hours faster? Or if Napoleon had simply ignored the mud and attacked at 7 a.m.? In this timeline, the Prussian specter never arrives in time. At 7 a.m., Wellington's army is standing alone. By noon, the time the real battle was only just beginning, the British center would have been under the full weight of the French Imperial Guard. Without the distraction of the Prussians on his flank, Napoleon could have committed his entire reserve at once. History experts suggest that Wellington's thin red line would have been trampled. In this world, there is no British Pax Britannica. There is no Victorian era. Instead, we see a Napoleonic peace, where French law, the metric system, and the French language become the undisputed standard from London to Moscow. What if Marshal Grouchy had listened to his generals and marched to the sound of the guns? Imagine the scene at 4 p.m. Wellington is desperate, waiting for Blucher. Suddenly, a massive column of troops appears on the horizon. But they aren't wearing Prussian black. They are wearing French blue. Grouchy's 33,000 fresh soldiers slam into the side of the British line, while the Prussians are still miles away, tangled in the woods. The result? A reverse Waterloo. Wellington is captured or forced to flee to the coast. Napoleon regains his throne, and the European powers, terrified of his renewed genius, are forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. The United States, a French ally, likely becomes the dominant power in the Americas without British interference. What if that ammunition wagon had actually reached the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte? If the King's German Legion had been resupplied, they might have held that farm until sunset. If the farm never falls, Napoleon can never bring his artillery close enough to shatter Wellington's center. The British line stays strong, and Napoleon exhausts his army in futile assaults against the stone wall. He might have been forced to retreat earlier, preserving enough of his army to fight another day, leading to a lingering, bloody civil war across Europe that could have lasted another decade. When we look at these files, we see that the margin of victory was razor thin. Modern computer simulations of the battle often show that even a 30-minute shift in the Prussian arrival time or a slightly more aggressive French cavalry pursuit could have flipped the result. Waterloo wasn't a shoe-in. It was a close-run thing, as Wellington himself admitted. The missing hours are the cracks where these alternate histories live. They remind us that the world we live in, the borders we cross, the languages we speak, the very way our economies function, was decided by a few handfuls of minutes in a Belgian mudflat. The what-if files prove that Napoleon didn't just lose to a better army. He lost to the clock. And in the final chapter, We'll see how those lost hours created a shadow that still stretches over the Europe of today. The smoke eventually cleared, the mud dried, and the screams of the dying faded into the silence of the Belgian countryside. But the missing hours of June 18th, 1815, did not vanish. Instead, they crystallized into the foundation of the modern world. Every minute Napoleon hesitated, and every second the Prussians marched faster than expected acted as a chisel, carving the shape of the next 2 centuries. If you look at the globe today, you're looking at the long shadow of Waterloo. Before Waterloo, Britain was a powerful island nation. After Waterloo, it became the undisputed manager of the world. Because Wellington held the ridge and Napoleon lost the clock, the British Empire entered a century of dominance known as the Pax Britannica. With the French ogre caged on St. Helena, Britain had no rivals left on the high seas. Those missing hours in the Belgian mud paved the way for the English language to become the global tongue of commerce, for the London fog to become the center of the financial world, and for a small island to rule a quarter of the Earth's landmass. Perhaps the most ironic shadow of the battle belongs to the Prussians. By arriving exactly when they did, the Prussian military gained a prestige that transformed their national identity. They were no longer just a collection of German states. They were the saviors of Europe. The efficiency and grit they showed in the woods of St. Lambert became the blueprint for the Prussian military machine. This surge of German nationalism, born in the heat of the counterattack, eventually led to the unification of Germany under Bismarck decades later. In a strange twist of fate, the very force that helped Britain defeat Napoleon would, a century later, become the rival that challenged Britain in 2 world wars. The seeds of 1914 were sown in the mud of 1815. The death of the great man theory. Waterloo also changed how we think about history itself. Napoleon was the ultimate great man, a figure who believed he could bend reality to his will through sheer genius and ego. His defeat at the hands of mud, logistical errors, and a stubborn clock prove that even the greatest titans are subject to the friction of war. It taught us that history isn't just made by brilliant speeches or grand charges. It's made by the missing things. The ammunition that didn't arrive, the messenger who got lost, the rain that wouldn't stop. It's a lesson in humility for every leader who thinks they have mastered the future. The final echo. Today, the battlefield of Waterloo is a quiet place of pilgrimage. But if you stand on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean as the sun begins to set, you can almost feel the weight of those missing hours. You can imagine the emperor checking his watch, Wellington looking toward the trees, and the thousands of soldiers whose lives were traded for a few ticks of the clock. This shadow over Waterloo is a reminder that we are all living in the aftermath of a single, chaotic afternoon. The missing hours didn't just change Europe. They defined the limits of human ambition. They remind us that while we might try to plan every move, history is often decided by the things we cannot control: the weather, the terrain, and the relentless, unforgiving passage of time. Napoleon tried to stop the clock. The clock won. And the world we know today is what was left behind when the ticking finally stopped.